Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter, for that very kind introduction. Yes, I'm going to try and talk about some of the new research which I'm doing, which is on indigeneity. But this is a project which is very much connected to and born out of the previous work I've been doing, which Peter was talking about there in the introduction on resilience. So I'm coming out of a period of writing. I've finished 2 books recently in the last 5 years, which have been on this subject of resilience. One, Resilient Life with Brett Evans, and the other one called The Neoliberal Subject, Resilience, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, which is written with David Chandler. And those are 2 critiques of the concept of resilience, attempts to unearth the dark relationships between this new discourse of resilience, which is gradually but quite dramatically displacing the traditional concepts and discourses around security in international relations. Trying to connect those studies with the ways in which indigeneity is being framed in international politics today as a phenomenon of resilience, the way in which indigenous peoples as such are being identified as exemplary forms of resilient subject, and therefore trying to think about the relationship between these new discourses on indigeneity in international relations and political discourses on resilience, and how they connect with what I see as being a neoliberal strategy of resilience. So I don't know how familiar you are with the concept of resilience, and I'm not sure how prevalent it is in policy and in critical discourses here in France compared with the Anglo-American world, where it's very, very popular indeed, very, very powerful. But yeah, it's something which I'm deeply suspicious of, the way in which we are being taught to believe that security is no longer something that we can aspire to, whether we are states, whether we are societies, whether we are individuals coping with our everyday worlds, the way in which this new idea of resilience is displacing this traditional concept of security. What do we understand by resilience? Well, resilience, from my perspective, is a very different concept to security. Security presumes our ability to achieve a state of being free from danger, transcendent from danger, therefore free of the problem of risk. It presumes a certain kind of certainty in terms of our relationship with our world. One is secure because one knows the world, and one is able to predict its movements and therefore transcend the dangers which it might otherwise possibly pose at us. Resilience, on the other hand, means something completely different. It means to be exposed endemically to danger. It presumes our inability to know the world and to ever be able to secure ourselves from the kinds of dangers which it throws at us. It assumes risk. It assumes the riskiness of existence. And indeed, it also valorizes danger. It doesn't see danger as something which we ought to be free from, or to think of ourselves as desiring freedom from. It sees danger as something from which we can grow, as a source of life, in other words, as something which helps us to live, which promotes our life, which increases our livability. So in other words, it's a totally different ontology of world and subjectivity which is at stake in this new discourse of resilience. A totally different understanding of the nature of what it is to be a human and what it is indeed to live well as a human being. And likewise as any other kind of living thing, because another assumption underlying this new discourse of resilience is that it's something which we share as human beings with every other living species. Everything that lives, according to the philosophy of resilience, is a phenomenon of resilience. There's no distinction between the human and any other living system, be it any other animal species or any other ecosystem. Anything that lives because it is resilient, because it's able to respond to danger and to react to its exposure to danger and to grow from being exposed to danger. And in political terms, I see this as being deeply malevolent in terms of the ways in which it plays into neoliberal strategies which promote the idea that we have to accept danger as an inevitability of living. You can see the way in which this underlies neoliberal philosophies of economy, the way in which we are taught to believe that in a global economy, danger is endemic and economic disasters can hit, and that they are things, indeed, phenomena from which economies themselves can grow and recover. So it naturalizes danger in a way that plays into a neoliberal way of thinking about the nature of the world itself, in economic terms, but also in political terms, in terms of the ways in which we can see terrorism being conceptualized today, for example, as an inevitability of international life, as a phenomenon, as a threat to social life, which the state cannot possibly solve or prevent from happening, and which society itself, therefore, and individuals, therefore, have to be able to deal with on their own terms and bounce back and recover when those disastrous events, disastrous attacks do indeed occur, as they will, as we're taught to understand, by neoliberal regimes of governance here in Europe, but elsewhere too. This is the argument that I've played out in the two books, The Neoliberal Subject and Resilient Life. I'm now moving into this new project which concerns what would seem to be at first glance something entirely different. It's a focus on indigeneity, the life and politics of indigenous peoples, but which is very much, I think, related to this problem of resilience. Insofar as when we look at contemporary discourses on indigeneity and indigenous peoples, we see the idea growing that indigenous peoples are exemplars of resilient subjects. They are peoples who have learnt to live with danger historically. And most importantly of all, ecologically, they're identified as people who can adapt to and cope with extreme climate change, even ecological catastrophe, and cope with extreme weather events in ways that we, presuming that all of us are Western peoples, Western subjects, non-indigenous peoples, in the ways which we are identified as being poor at, incapable of doing. And therefore the underlying assumption within these new discourses on indigeneity and indigenous peoples is that we, the West, have a lot to learn from the indigenous in terms of our abilities to become resilient. If we are to become resilient in the ways in which neoliberal regimes of governance argue that we have to in order to cope with our worlds, then we have a lot to learn from indigenous peoples because they are the exemplars of resilience. Their knowledge systems are continually changing and adapting in correspondence with the ways in which the world itself is changing. There's a different ontology, different political ontology underneath the philosophies of indigenous peoples, which we, the West, can learn a lot from, and which we need to learn from in order to evacuate our Western systems of knowledge, which are holding us back, preventing us from becoming resilient, because we're still invested in an archaic idea of security. We, the West, still believe, or some of us still believe, that security might be something that we can still achieve, some level of transcendence of danger, the idea of a life which is no longer defined by risk and uncertainty. These are problems for the West, it's argued, and therefore we have much to learn from the indigenous in order to be able to let go of our old ideals of security and embrace this new idea of resilience. Resilience is really the major talent of indigenous peoples. And this is a problem, this is a phenomenon which I'm exploring in a project which is funded by the Finnish Academy, the Academy of Finland. It started last year in 2016, and it's going to run until the end of 2020. And it's a collaborative project. It's one that I'm doing with a couple of postdoc researchers in Lapland, the University of Lapland, Heidi Sinivara-Niskunen and Mario Lindroth, whose article I hope you have read because it was in the required reading list for the session today. And they're coming at this connection between indigeneity and resilience very much in the same ways that I am. And indeed, I've learned a lot from them. I supervise their PhDs, and now we're working together, trying to develop a critical take and intervention upon this growing discourse around indigeneity and resilience. And I think we're quite isolated in this context, because if you look at, if you Google scholar, indigeneity and resilience, what you'll get back is a load of research which really valorizes, in quite naive terms, the resilience of indigenous peoples. It's seen as an unproblematic claim, the claim that the indigenous are resilient. You encounter it in political discourse, but you also encounter it in ecological as well as significantly anthropological discourse. All of the anthropology, pretty much all of the anthropology around indigenous peoples talks about their resilience in valorizing terms. It seemed to be something very positive and very powerful, as well as empowering for indigenous peoples. Why would one want to question this resilience of indigenous peoples, given that it's a marker of their superiority, in a sense, to the West? It's of course a fact that historically the indigenous have been colonized by Western states and societies, that we have been taught historically to look down upon indigenous peoples, to see them inferior from the West and from Europe. If you go right back to the 17th century, and if you read the founding texts of modern Western political theory, if you read John Locke's Second Treatise on Government, another text that was on your reading list for this session, you read how he describes the Native Americans back in the 17th century, and how he describes them as living like animals because they don't own property and they don't cultivate the land and don't suborn the earth in the ways in which we within the West have learnt to suborn the earth and have thought of ourselves as being superior to other peoples on account of our power to suborn the earth and to exploit it and to extract its resources and to control it and to think of ourselves as transcendent of it, as well as each and every other living species. This whole historically sedimented way of seeing the difference between the West and the indigenous is in effect, the anthropologists would argue, being overturned by this new science of resilience. So it seemed to be an emancipatory move in the development of a post-colonial moment in Western philosophy and knowledge more widely. It's also asserted very powerfully in policy. If you look at the discourses on indigeneity and the policies around indigenous peoples developed by the major international organizations concerned with the governance of the indigenous and the promotion of the rights and well-being of the indigenous, be it within the United Nations system or be it within the Arctic Council, which is a very powerful organization where I live in Finnish Lapland, but also throughout the wider region of the Arctic Circle. You find this idea prevalent, to the extent that at the end of last year, around this time last year, the Arctic Council, it has to be said also, a relatively unknown still international organization when we compare it with other international organizations, but nevertheless very powerful in the Arctic. And I'm sure you're all also aware of how increasingly important the Arctic is becoming internationally, geopolitically, in terms of the struggle and the conflict over resources and sovereignty, indeed, in the Arctic Circle, the struggles between different Arctic states, Russia, Canada, and the other Nordic states, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, the Arctic Council is very powerful in pushing forward this idea of indigenous resilience when it comes to the governance of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. And at the end of last year, they published this, what they called resilience report, which is an attempt to think strategy and to think resilience as a strategy for the development of the Arctic and for the development of the life of the many different kinds of people who live in the Arctic. Because the Arctic is, of course, not only populated by indigenous peoples, but many different kinds of peoples, including European nations, etc., etc. But this idea that the indigenous peoples of the Arctic are resilient, and that the resilience is there to be promoted and increased, and that other people within the Arctic can learn from the indigenous in likewise learning to become resilient, and therefore cope with the ecological catastrophes and the extreme climate change, which we know is already happening in the Arctic and only going to have increasing effects over the next few decades and further on into the future. This idea that the indigenous can nevertheless cope with those extreme climate events and with even ecological catastrophe, irrespective of the massive implications and effects and destructions of their traditional ways of life, which are going to be had by those catastrophes and by those extreme weather events and by the ways in which the climate in the Arctic is changing, the landscape is changing, the relationships between human beings and other species are changing, and the ways in which species are migrating, moving away as a result of climate change. This investment in resilience in the Arctic is very, very powerful in policy terms, in the policy terms of the Arctic Council, and also of the relevant Arctic states, including, from my perspective, most importantly, the state of Finland, where I live and which indeed is funding me to conduct this research, interestingly enough. And it's also asserted by the anthropologists. If you go into the anthropology journals and look at discourses on indigeneity, you find this idea over and over again that they are indeed resilient and that we Western peoples have much to learn from the indigenous. This is the basic argument offered in another article in your required readings for this session, the piece by Laura Rival on indigenous resilience. One can also encounter it in more philosophical forms of critique and thinking. Indigenous peoples and indigenous subjects are increasingly popular reference points for some of the most powerful critical philosophers of our time. So for example, if you read Judith Butler's relatively recent work, Dispossession, written with Athena Athanasiou, she talks about how we within the West have much to learn from the indigenous in terms of their cultivation of a practice and an ethos of being dispossessed over and against the liberal ethos of wanting always to claim possession and thinking and construing human subjectivity in terms of the ability to possess. So for even the most critical thinkers of our time, the Judith Butlers, the indigenous offer a powerful alternative to specifically liberal subjectivity. So from Western political theoretical perspectives, the indigenous offer us a way forward and a way out of the traps of liberal modernity. They can teach us how to live a dispossessed and less possessive life, as well as how to sacrifice our investments in traditional modalities of security. And this corresponds likewise with Butler's critique of security, developed in her earlier work, the book on vulnerability, and going right back even further still to 2004, and the book Precarious Life, which I think came out in 2004, and then Frames of War. Practically all of her work can be situated within a growing interest in indigeneity as a field of alternatives to Western political subjectivity, and especially liberal political subjectivity. It's also very popular in queer theory more widely. So if you read the work of another American queer theorist, Elizabeth Povinelli, her philosophical work is born out of longer-standing anthropological studies and arguments concerning the alternatives which the indigenous have to offer the Western subject. So there's something very, very powerful going on here in terms of this turn to the indigenous in policy, in philosophy, in anthropology, and most certainly now also in international relations. You can also find it in very popular books, like, for example, Rebecca Solnit's book, The Art of Getting Lost, which is also on your reading list, on your suggested reading list for this session. She talks about the Wintu people of California and their relationship with language and how it presumes a completely alternative ontology, and how the Wintu cannot get lost because they make no claim to know the world in a way that would enable them to get lost. If we simply sacrifice our assumptions about bearings and maps and territory and being itself, then we can develop a completely different way of existing in relationship with the world, Solnit argues, in ways that are very consistent with these broader trends in philosophy and political theory in anthropology. So the indigenous are seen very much as offering us a way forward and a way out of the traps of liberal modernity, which is obviously a very different kind of argument to the one which I'm making in my work now concerning how this discourse on indigenous resilience actually plays into a neoliberal strategy of subjectification. Because if you buy the argument which I'm making, which is that resilience is simply a way of subjectifying people such that they will accept a neoliberal way of living and seeing the world, then it would seem to offer a very contradictory way of thinking to that offered in these various discourses, these various valorizing discourses on indigeneity. So I'm coming at indigeneity from a much more critical angle than that which I see happening in these various literatures. And especially from that offered, for example, in the Arctic Council report, which is probably the most important reading for this session on your reading list for this week. I hope you've had a chance to have a look at that report and see how it talks about resilience in these very, very positive terms, and how it goes through case studies, different analyses of the different capacities for resilience of different kinds of indigenous peoples within the Arctic, and how it tries to draw, and does indeed draw, differences, distinctions between different indigenous peoples on account of their varying abilities for resilience. So when it talks about the Inuit of Canada, it talks about how wonderfully adept they are at resilience, while when it talks about some of the reindeer herding communities of Russian Siberia, Arctic Siberia, it talks about how weak and problematic their non-resilience is in correspondence or comparison with that of the Inuit of Canada, as well as of Greenland, where they also live. So there's something going on here, which is, I think, not just dangerous for the West in terms of the ways in which we are being taught to think about indigeneity as something which we have to aspire to become, and that's why the title for this session is Becoming Indigenous, because I see indigeneity as something which today is no longer simply identified with indigenous peoples. That's why I distinguish also between indigeneity and indigenous peoples. Indigeneity doesn't simply belong to indigenous peoples. It's something which each and everyone can, in effect, become if we are able to learn how to be resilient. It's something which we can all become. This is the argument also of Laura Rival when she compares the resilience of the Makushi people of northern Guyana and northern Brazil and southern Guyana with the resilience of the activists of California, who she talks about in the article. So there's something going on here in terms of the way in which indigeneity is shifting from being a property of indigenous peoples to being something which any kind of subject can potentially learn and develop as a skill set, which I find very interesting, but also deeply dangerous. On the other hand, I think we might also try to think about how this new discourse on resilience could be located within a Western tradition of thinking about subjectivity, maybe outside that of the modern. So I've also been thinking about the way in which, if we go back to the origins of the West, if we go back to the ancients, to the Greeks and the Romans, and look at the literatures on, for example, Stoicism, one finds a certain way of thinking about human subjectivity and practices, or what Michel Foucault, of course, called towards the end of his career in life, care of the self. How practices of care of the self among the Stoics and those minor philosophers and thinkers who Foucault was interested in when he unearthed the whole history of care of the self, how we might find within those literatures certain ideas which are basically ideas around resilience. So if you read, for example, Epictetus, when he talks about learning how to live and how to live in ways that would presume the uncertainty of the world and presume the malevolence of existence and presumption that the worst will always happen and always be prepared for the worst always happening. There's something going on there in those ancient literatures which I think might be seen to play into our post-colonial, postmodern notions of resilience and the idea of evacuating security. So on the one hand, there's this orientalized image of the indigenous, which would seem to be about debunking the Western tradition and grasping and embracing something completely alternative from outside of the West, the life and practices of the indigenous. But it seems to me that it also plays into very deep-seated traditions within the West itself, going back to the ancients and ideas concerning care of the self, and that's something which I would like to develop much further in this project as an analytic. But my major argument, which I want to propose for you today, is that actually this is disastrous for political subjectivity. That political subjectivity requires a certain commitment to a belief in the possibility to make oneself secure, to be able to, in a certain sense, aspire to free oneself from danger and to prevent the worst from happening, to transcend the dangers and threats which we can identify in the world around us. For me, political subjectivity requires that foundational hubris. There has to be this belief in the possibility to free oneself from danger and even transform the world such that it complies to one's own needs and wishes, such that one can remake the world in order for it to be more secure for oneself. For me, at least, political subjectivity demands that hubris, demands that aspiration to security. It demands a way of thinking about the possibility for existence which goes beyond mere resilience, mere survival, mere adaptation to continuously arising danger, and the belief in the ability to transcend danger and to achieve something like security, regardless of the many problems which we know security to pose in political terms. Here we are in École Normale Supérieure, set up in 1794 by Robespierre, in the wake of the Terror, a decade in French history saturated in the discourse of security. We know the malevolence and the horrific violence which the idea of security inaugurated in France, in Paris, in that time. Regardless of those problems with security, which I don't want to wish away, and which we have to face, I want to maintain, nevertheless, that there is something fundamentally emancipatory in the possibility for we, as political subjects, to aspire to security, that we can't really do politics, in fact, without it, that we can't become political subjects without believing in security. And that resilience is really a strategy which functions to disempower us, to de-weaponize us, and to prevent us from being able to aspire in such emancipatory terms. And that in order to fight neoliberalism, therefore, we're also going to have to not only fight resilience, but refuse this blackmail and this demand to become indigenous, and to refuse this model of indigeneity, which is offered to us as a way out of liberal modernity, because it debases us as much as it debases the indigenous, I think. I'm deeply suspicious of these discourses around indigenous resilience, regardless of the fact that many indigenous peoples themselves might be participating today in the chorus of resilience. And it is, of course, a fact that if we go into indigenous critique and read the work of many of the most major indigenous philosophers, that they are likewise engaged in promoting this idea of indigenous resilience. Me, myself, in looking at indigenous critique and reading indigenous philosophy and indigenous authors, I'm interested in thinkers and writers who do something else, who think about human subjectivity and the world around us in different terms. And it's in that context that I've been reading, a classic of indigenous critique, but a much maligned classic, which is a very romantic text from the 1960s called Journey to Ixtlan, which is written by the great, I think, great American anthropologist Carlos Castaneda. And Castaneda goes to talk to this native Indian, supposedly on the pretext of wanting to learn from him about his knowledge concerning plants. But for those of you who have read this wonderful book, you'll know that it turns into a journey of self-discovery for Castaneda as he learns from the Indian not how to use plants to achieve drug-induced states, but how to in effect become a master of one's own existence, how to learn to care for the self in Foucauldian terms, but in a way that would allow one to transcend dangers and fears, and to become one's own master of one's own self and of one's own world. That's the way in which I read Castaneda's journey to Ixtlan, and it's that idea of that alternative model of indigeneity which I'm trying to develop in the project. But I think there are also resources that we can dig from the Western cultural tradition too. And there are also trends and traditions taking place right now in Western critique, which I'm also interested in, which I think are also consistent with the work which I'm trying to do. So I'm especially interested in the work of the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk and his 3-volume study called Spheres, which is in effect, I think, arguing something quite consistent with what I'm arguing about, the debasement of political subjectivity, which is here occurring at the end of neoliberal modernity, in his attempt to recover the idea of spheric existence and of wholeness. And Sloterdijk, as I see it, is taking his ideas from the work of another great French philosopher of the 20th century, one who is nevertheless much less popular today than the Foucaults and the Deleuze's and the Baudrillards, the postmodernists as they're sometimes described. And that is the work of the great philosopher of the Sorbonne, Gaston Bachelard, and his work on poetic subjectivity, his wonderful work on dreams and of flight and of movement, which I think also play into these ideas. You might know Bachelard. I hope that you've read Bachelard, being good French student. His work was really a critique of many of the fundamentals, the Heideggerian fundamentals, which came to inform the kind of postmodern critique of the Western subjects. And I'm interested in how we can use Bachelard and Sloterdijk, as well as minor traditions within indigenous critique, to think political subjectivity in terms of its capacity for security over and against mere resilience, which I see as being simply a foil for neoliberal strategies of subjectification. That's really where I'm at with my work, and I'm interested to learn from you what you've taken from the readings for this session and how this sounds to you, how these ideas sound.
Thank you, Julian. The presentation had 2 parts. Essentially, one is the description of this new term, which sure.
Please, sorry. Thank you.
It was a description of the term that you're observing and the characteristics and the way the different fields of spheres of knowledge have been dealing with it. And then the second part, which was sort of your project, your plan for the project, that the critique and the recovery of the political subject. So I'd have a couple of questions and comments about both. I find this is something new to me, this concept of indigeneity, but that's, of course, I've always thought of it in the tradition of Orientalism, which you did not mention. So I wanted to start by asking you how it fits into that romanticization, the European Western romanticization of the Oriental. Is that a form for indigeneity in your concept of the phenomenon?
I mean, I think it is an orientalized image. It's presented to us as a non-orientalized image. It's presented to us as a set of ideas and practices which the West is not foisting upon the indigenous, but which the indigenous are offering us. But I'm deeply suspicious of it. I mean, I think it is an orientalized and a romanticized image. I mean, the problem is, of course, that a lot of this discourse is being generated from within indigenous critique itself, and we have indigenous philosophers sort of self-representing and saying that they've got something to say about themselves which is different to that which has been said historically by the West about the indigenous. And clearly there's a major contrast between these ideas around indigenous resilience and the historical Orientalism the historically Orientalist discourses around indigeneity as they developed from the 17th century up until, well, really quite recently, you know, because this shift is really very, very recently, and it's not long ago. So, you know, if we're looking at the history of relations between the West and indigenous peoples over the last 50 years, we can still encounter the same modernist Western conceit concerning the inferiority of indigenous peoples, you know, especially in the Nordic countries where I live and where I know you once lived too, in Norway and Sweden and Finland. It's not long ago that indigenous people were having their children taken from them and put into special schools so that they could be taught, you know, and so they could be saved from the depravity of their parents and own communities on account of their supposed inferiority and debasement. So clearly there's a shift going on, but it is very much, I think it's very much an Orientalist image.
So have you given thought to what provoked the shift? I mean, it's, what you're describing about taking the children, the Sami children, for example, in northern Norway, this was a part of the modernization process in the 20th century. But what has provoked this turn that you're describing? Or do you see any sort of concrete way to situate it?
I mean, clearly and importantly, one does have to situate it within the context of the political conflict which has arisen between indigenous peoples and Western states, and the growing awareness of the wrongs that have been done to indigenous peoples by those states, and the growing ability of indigenous peoples to find the ability to challenge the West and challenge the states and make their own set of claims, and to enunciate those claims in terms which are no longer derided in the ways that they were historically. And clearly the growth of this discourse in indigenous resilience can only be understood in that context. It's important to underline that. But the fact is, I think, that when we're looking at specifically this concept and discourse of resilience, you know, it doesn't emerge within indigenous critique or indigenous knowledge, because I've done the genealogy.
It's external.
Yeah, yeah. It emerges in the 60s and 70s in political ecology, and then it grows in the 70s and 80s through the advance of the project of sustainable development, which then gradually becomes colonized by neoliberalism and neoliberal actors and discourses in the 80s and 90s, and then explodes somewhere around the turn of this century, and significantly around 2002 with the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. You have this massive growth and interest in resilience as a whole, and concerns about how to build the resilience of the poor, how to shift policy from security to resilience as a way of incorporating concerns over the environment and change the development and economic policies of states so that the environment will no longer be exploited. It's within that context that resilience itself grows as a discourse and concept. And then somewhere along the way, you have a convergence, I think, between the growth and change in the discourse around indigeneity, fostered by these political conflicts, and this ideology of resilience as it begins to form over the last, well, really only 15 years, and such that the state then starts to take an interest in the indigenous as an exemplary form of resilient subject, and then begins to, well, manipulate it and co-opt it as a way of then foisting it back upon Western peoples, such that they can be neoliberalized. And likewise, in tandem, the indigenous can also be neoliberalized. I think that's what has taken place. So it's complex, and it's very messy, and it's by no means binary. It's not that it's all bad either. It's a complex set of conflicts which is taking place.
It's quite interesting how ironic it is if you think of the colonization of North America by the Spanish and others, and the waves of indigenous people who died because they weren't resilient against the European diseases.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. Nice point. Yeah.
But you mentioned the sort of, there's kind of a moral economy that's going on, that we realize the bads we've done, and this was part of the provocation of the turn towards the admiration of it. There's also in the, I don't know if you're aware, in Europe and in France on the political right, there's a certain discourse of guilt, anti-guilt, that is, a certain discourse. I'm thinking of somebody like Pascal Buchner, who among through many essays and novels rejects what he sees as European guilt toward the indigenous peoples, towards the developing world, that we don't need to have that at all, and that we should be transcending that. That fits into your description.
I mean, yeah, of course, it's true that you do have these attempts to reject guilt and to even celebrate colonialism, and to say, colonialism wasn't bad at all, and we shouldn't feel guilty for what was done because what was done to them was necessary, and actually they're better off today than they were historically, and therefore, I mean, I wouldn't argue that, of course. It's not that I'm not trying to say that what happened historically was right. It was awful. It was terrible. But I'm also not buying the argument that resilience is an alternative to colonialism. That it is a post-colonial discourse as such. I see resilience very much as a colonizing discourse. This is the way in which the indigenous today are being colonized, in effect. It's not to say that the older discourses and practices of colonialism don't exist or that they don't pose dangers. I don't think they're as dangerous today as they might otherwise seem to be, even though they continue to exist in the shadows of Western critique. I think resilience poses much greater dangers to indigenous peoples today than those older historical discourses, which may continue to live on in some kind of ghost form.
Resilience as a discourse, as a normative.
Yeah.
You should be resilient.
Yeah.
We should be resilient.
Yeah. I mean, if we look, it's very interesting to read this Arctic Council report and this set of case studies of indigenous peoples, and to look beneath the surface of what's going on there when indigenous peoples are celebrated for being resilient. For example, the Inuit of Canada, as they are celebrated in this Arctic Council report. Why are they celebrated as examples of resilience in the report? Well, because they've adapted to extreme climate change, and they've sacrificed. They've succeeded in sacrificing their traditional practices and ways of living, and embraced a totally different economy and way of survival, which as the council report describes, is one based on art. So many Inuit in Canada have learned to make art, to paint and to sculpt and to produce and to sell their art internationally via gallerists based in Toronto and Montreal and other Canadian cities within an international network of art. But if we look beneath the surface of this reality, one finds that the price for which this art is sold it's a pittance. It's like a few $100 Canadian, and there's a whole political economy of art around this indigenous art, which itself is actually non-indigenous. Many of these gallerists are not indigenous at all, and yet they're profiting from the production of the art, which supposedly represents the exemplary resilience of the Inuit of Canada.
Well, the floor is open if you'd want to comment or ask. I could, in the meantime, this, what I guess we'd call a pedagogical dimension of indigeneity. That's something we can and should learn, that we can learn it. It strikes me if there's something which is coherently understandable as indigeneity, it's that which is not reducible to an epistemological categories, to knowledge that can just be transmitted. And indeed, that's exactly what makes it resilient, is that it's somehow a hard kernel which can't be broken and distributed and passed on. So there's something really, it strikes me, paradoxical in this idea that we could actually learn from someone who's indigenous. The ability to learn and transmit knowledge in this sort of magisterial way like we're doing here seems like it's in conflict with the very idea, no?
Possibly. But you could also think about it, it's a bit like Socrates, isn't it? He's saying, there's one thing I have to teach you, which is that you know nothing. And that you also can know nothing, actually. Right? And if I can teach you that much, then you'll at least know something. It's not that different, actually, from that gambit.
Doesn't the resilience in part depend on the mythic character? That you can't find the origin, you can't know what it is, and therefore that's why it's impervious to destruction,
Yeah, it is presented that way often. I mean, you'll often read the claim that the indigenous are unassimilable. That there's something to being indigenous which simply cannot be, it can't be explained, it cannot be represented, it cannot be passed on to you unless you happen to inhabit this particular kind of body in this way. It's a way of being. It's a way, to use that kind of Zen term, something which cannot really be learnt, but can maybe nevertheless be performed. But it it's also very difficult to judge where and how it's performed and how it's claimed. And it's also very difficult to contest if someone does claim it.
I mean, a certain form of culture, a certain concept of culture would say that you can't learn culture. I wrote an essay once, sort of in pedagogical philosophy, called Learning to be Norwegian. And it was comparing the two different schools of pedagogical theory, the one saying that it was impossible to be taught a national culture, that you have to sort of grow in it. You can't just give you can't just learn the language or give the passport or whatever. You have to sort of have an experience of it, which is intangible. And then the other theory, which is much more knowledge-based, that says that, you can actually go to school. We can send the immigrants, for example, to the Finnish culture school, and within 2 years, they're ready to go. They're ready to integrate. And it really came down that the Norwegians were fascinated with this idea that it's unteachable, it's untransmittable, and therefore you better learn it, or therefore you'd better get it. It's sort of completely direct paradox. And it strikes me that the way you're describing indigeneity is very much the same. And I repeat myself a little bit, but it strikes me that that's what makes it resilient, is that you can't touch it.
Yeah.
Can you give some more examples of what the negative effects of widespread normative discourse around resilience are, in more sort of tangible terms, apart from the outgoings? Excuse me, would you mind repeating the question, because we didn't have a microphone?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So what's negative about resilience for the indigenous and for people more widely? Well, I think if you accept resilience, then you're accepting the idea that the world is one in which you can only ever aspire to survive. You accept that danger is endemic, that it's something which you're always going to be faced with, that you cannot imagine a world in which danger itself would no longer be a problem, that you cannot conceive of being able to transcend the dangers of the world, that threat is something which you're always going to be faced with, that you're going to have to learn to live with it, and you're also going to have to adapt to danger when it reveals itself. You have to expose yourself to it and be able to adapt to its occurrence, to bring it within you, and to grow from it, to live off it, to cultivate it, to cultivate your relationship with it. I mean, many would say, the proponents of resilience would say, well, yes, that's right. That's what life is, and that is actually something to aspire to. That you will live a better life, be better equipped to exist in this world if you learn that the world is really one simply of survival and of continuous adaptation and readaptation to danger, to one's exposure to dangers which are endemic. I see that as a deeply negative way of thinking about the world and human subjectivity. I think it debases the very kernel of what it is to be human, which is this ability to aspire to security, to free oneself from danger, to transcend the world such that one is able to transform it so that it meets one's own needs and fits one's own image of how it ought to be organized, as opposed to presuming that the world simply is and that one has to change oneself in order to make oneself fit into a world, the dangers of which are non-negotiable. So I see that as a deeply malevolent move within critique and ways of thinking about world and human subjectivity. It's negative insofar as it debases our very abilities to be human and to practice politics. Yeah, the concepts are practices. There's a wonderful little essay by Foucault, or maybe it's an interview actually, which he gave towards the end of his life, which I like very much. It's on security actually, so it's very relevant to this discussion that we're having. It's called The Risks of Security, and he's talking about the concept of security, the problems with the concept of security, and he says something like, we should never condemn concepts. It's wrong to condemn concepts. Because concepts, even a concept as historically malevolent and dangerous as security, are practices. We can reinvent them such that they can perform a different kind of work in the world to that which they have performed. So perhaps, I can allow for the possibility that it is conceivable that we could reinvent this concept of resilience such that it would do something different, such that it would allow people to think in terms of the ability to bounce forwards, to move out of one situation and into another, and not simply bouncing back and coping and surviving and adapting to what is. But then if that's really our project, conceptually, I'm not sure resilience is the best place to start, given that it's so grounded already in a very different way of thinking about what it is to be and what it is that we can aspire to. It's really about survival, this concept of resilience. And I think we already have better concepts which would allow us to think in terms of transforming the world, transformation not least of all, to the concept of resilience. So I'm certainly not invested in saving resilience.
A little farther in this direction. Your what should I say, interpretation of resilience in the direction of neoliberalism is in a certain way a critique of individualism. Maybe you disagree. It strikes me as it's a certain critique of putting the responsibility onto the individual, a reliance on the individual, et cetera, et cetera. Could you envisage a use of the concept, an understanding of the concept of resilience, which refers to collectivities? So this expression, resilient societies, that we have in the European jargon, in the European level jargon. Is that meaningful? Can it be meaningful? Does that give you more, do you find that more encouraging in terms of a new use of the term resilience, or kind of resilience which would build on retooling or modifying solidarity, forms of solidarity or forms of communal help or interaction or reflection? Is that an alternative?
It's a really good question. Clearly, if resilience is functioning communally, if people are doing resilience together, then there's something different going on to an individual performing resilience through working on his or herself. I can allow for the fact that on a communal level, resilience can be seen to work to generate certain kinds of solidarity, to build social bonds, to foster relationships, to enable community. But if the end to which that building of resilience communally is functioning is that of enabling that communal organism simply to cope and survive in its relationship with the world, then one has to also see the extent to which the solidarity it's creating is a very limited one. It's only a solidarity in the face of prevailing and endemic danger. So it still doesn't allow for that communal body to conceive of its transformation towards some kind of transcendental state. So yes and no. It's clearly different if it's communal to if it's individual, and maybe one could even say it's better, or it's at least geared towards a certain kind of politics. But it's also limited. If the horizon of the community is one of resilience itself, of mere resilience, then it's also deep. It's also nevertheless limiting. Do you see what I mean?
I do. A kind of solidarity which is based on finite dangers which are already imagined, which are essentially an impoverished kind of danger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you, I'm really fond of Butler's work on precariousness, fragility, and security. And my understanding of it, which I use a lot in my own work, is that somehow fragility is foundational. That instead of there being a solid bottom to being, there's some sort of fundamental instability and fragility, and which then disperses itself through all of being and existence. Can that be understood as, is that compatible with an understanding of indigeneity? I mean, the indigeneity concept seems to be based on an irreducible solidity, like I was talking about before, that there's something which cannot be crushed, which cannot be reduced or condensed. Is there a direct conflict between these two views? Is the security that you're hopeful about finding, that you, by recovering the concept of political subjectivity, like you talked about in the second half of the talk, is that based on a Butlerian form of fragility at the heart of being, or is it some other sort of trajectory of a relationship to danger where danger is essentially eradicated, that everything has become secure? Which I think Butler would not accept.
Yeah, I mean, I love Butler's work, and I read it all. I've read it all, and I really enjoy reading it. At the same time, I think there's a naivety to. I understand her argument for. I mean, you want to use fragility. She, of course, tends to use vulnerability, or she has done. But I think there's a naivety to the way in which she tries to reground politics and vulnerability over and against security, and to argue that therefore offers us an alternative to dominant Western liberal ways of thinking about the subject. Because if we look, more closely, and I think this is what makes it interesting actually to be a student and a scholar of international relations, because this very time period in which she develops this critique of security and investment in vulnerability is the very period in which we see the very same kind of trends happening within policy, within the most powerful Western states, not least her own state of the United States of America. Vulnerability is something which the American state becomes very interested in policy terms around this precise time, and likewise, and in relationship with resilience. America the vulnerable. We are vulnerable. These were discursive claims which the states, the President of the United States, was making at precisely the same time that you have Judith Butler, supposedly working to the left of the state and against liberalism, making. So it's important, it's at the very least important to recognize, I think, the extent to which her own critique is empowered, made possible by a shift within American policy and a critique of security and consequent move towards resilience within government. You couldn't really fit a cigarette paper between Butler's ontology and that of the Pentagon.
Oh, that took my breath away. Yeah. Would you accept, in this project of recovering political subjectivity, would you accept that there are two parallel and more or less completely incompatible claims. One is that we look towards the future and work towards a world which is secure, which is in which danger is absent, and that this is fundamentally impossible. That is to say that we have to work towards it, even in the knowledge that, or even in the suspicion, that's probably better put, that it's never going to come. But there's no alternative to trying.
Yeah, I mean, I think of course security is an illusion. There's no security. I mean, this is kind of the story which Castaneda tells in Journey to Ixtlan. You know, he gets to the last chapter, and that's where they reach Ixtlan, and then and Castaneda's there, the Indian is there, the Indian's friend is there, and they're all in tears because it's apparent that you don't get there. You're always struggling with danger, with not being the master of one's own existence, and of failure. And you're facing the reality that what you believe in is an illusion. But I think it's a necessary illusion, without which one doesn't go anywhere. You know, the ability to get somewhere presumes this illusion of security. And there's a whole art around cultivating one's relationship with the illusion and conceiving it as truth and working on one's own self through investing in it as truth, regardless of the fact, the reality that it is illusion. So, yeah.
Could we talk a little bit about place and geopolitics? You mentioned it briefly, but in theory, about half of everybody here is doing a master's in geopolitics. I mean, that's the total for the class anyway. What is the relationship between indigeneity and place? You didn't mention it. You mentioned the Arctic region and the geopolitics of the Arctic region. But certainly, I think most interpretations of indigeneity or of indigenous peoples in sort of anthropological discourses would say that there's something very fundamental about the relationship to the place where they are. And it's a place which is what we call around here non-Cartesian. That is, that it's not just uniformly organized space, but there's something deeply cultural linking to inner being and the rest. First of all, is that a property of indigeneity, which you just didn't mention, or is that interesting for you? And then secondly, how does that link to what you said about the reorganization of space in the Arctic region, for example, or anywhere? It really could be the reorganization of space and the reorganization of power in space. So power, place, and politics is kind of the constellation I want to invite you to say something about.
I mean, yes, you're certainly right, of course, that one does sometimes encounter this discourse around place in connection with indigeneity, that indigenous peoples are often identified as being so on account of the specificities of their relationship to a particular place, but place conceived in non-Cartesian terms. But I think underneath that there's actually something else going on in terms of the way in which indigeneity is being reconceptualized today as a phenomenon of relationship with the world as such, debased of place. So it's much more about an ontology of worldliness, which plays into discourses around globality and globalization, I think. Placelessness, in fact, and space as such, and worldliness and deep ontology. That's what I see happening anyway. So it's not about place; it's about space in the most metaphysical, non-place-like way.
I have, maybe it's from my poor education, but my sort of ground floor definition of indigenous is those people who were already there when we got there. We being, the colonists, the Westerners, etc. So it's something that there's a place, they belong there, that they somehow possessed it, owned it, referring to your talk about dispossession. and that somehow that belonging is more fundamental than whatever we could do by just arriving and building a house.
Yeah. There's that as well. There's that priorness to indigeneity, but it's not the simple fact of being prior, because of course in practice anybody could have been prior. It's not simply that they were prior, but it's that they were prior in a particular way. They were prior in this, as you described it, dispossessed or non-possessive way. So it's not the having been prior, it's the way in which they were prior, which I think qualifies them, or is seen to qualify them as indigenous. It's not simply enough to have been prior. It's the discovery of what it meant to be prior, I think.
But then when we're thinking the geopolitics around these regions like the Arctic, it's particularly interesting, of course, in northern Finland and Sweden. Isn't there at the very least a kind of imaginary reference, an imaginary understanding that there's something there which we're navigating around, that there's a sort of cultural, I don't know quite how to describe it, some sort of cultural primordiality, and that as much as we can call it a problem and try to re-educate the Lap children, the Sami children, or relocate them, or build schools or cultural centers or whatever, there's still something which is there, which is in our imaginary of the geography of the place, and therefore the geopolitics of the place, sort of making sort of the anchoring of this entire argument, this entire image, that there's something there at that place that happened before, yes, prior, but also something deeply before, longer before, that cannot be wiped away by, you can't put a parking lot there and fix it, it's still there. I don't know, it's just it's an image that I have somehow.
Yeah, right.
Unlettered image that I have.
I think I see where you're going. So what you're saying is it's not simply about time, it's about the geo, it's about the...
Yeah. Even the flow of power.
Yeah.
Something structuring geopolitics that's done in the Arctic region. Geopolitics in the modern sense, superficial sense of the word. It's navigating a kind of network of things that are already there, almost like milestones in landmarks, mountains and valleys that are already there. There is the trace of this indigenous culture that's there, which will always be there somehow, and that deforms the space-time continuum of geopolitics, if you like.
Yeah, I'm very bad at thinking about geopolitics. I've based my whole career on sort of critiquing geopolitics and saying, let's talk about biopolitics instead.
Yeah. No, me too, and that's of course. Part of the course was to say it's not about the geopolitics, it's about the risk. There we are.
Yeah. But in France, you have this much richer tradition, I think, of thinking about geopolitics in political theory and science. Am I right?
Well, you have a very rich tradition of thinking about geography, and geography is where geopolitics is.
But sort of in much more political and as well as strategic terms. Would that be right?
Like, yeah, there's a very strong strategic bent with geopolitics.
Yeah.
But it's also linked to human geography.
Would Raymond Aron fall within that? Yeah. Who was also here, right? He was also...
Yeah. Any last comments about the last for the whole year? All right, that just remains to thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you.